The Kron species, a race with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that glimmered with cold calculation, thrived on order and structure. Their society was built upon an unwavering belief in hierarchy, where every individual's value was determined by their rank. Leadership was sacrosanct, determined by an intricate system of status, and questioning a superior was unthinkable. For centuries, this system had led them to dominance in their sector of the galaxy. Their scientists and intelligence analysts were no exception, meticulously trained to understand potential adversaries through the lens of rank and hierarchy. When humanity entered their sphere of influence, the Kron were cautious, but intrigued. Early encounters suggested humans were not unlike themselves: structured military organizations, clear chain of command, and a penchant for discipline. To the Kron, this made humans a puzzle they felt confident in solving. For months, Kron analysts dissected every piece of information they could find about human military protocols. They pored over recordings of ceremonies, combed through intercepted transmissions, and analyzed battle footage. Words like general, commander, and sergeant became familiar. They categorized these titles and assigned each one a place in what they assumed was a rigid hierarchy similar to their own. By the time their fleet approached the human outpost on the barren moon of Pharos II, the Kron believed they understood their counterparts perfectly. The humans' apparent rank-based structure would ensure predictability. The Kron fleet, a display of disciplined precision, glided into orbit and established communication. Their diplomats prepared for negotiations with the commanding officer of the human installation, expecting to find an individual who mirrored their own leadership ideals. At the outpost, the humans had been preparing for weeks, though not without a sense of unease. Kron emissaries were known for their strict adherence to protocol, and the human officers were wary of unintentionally offending their guests. Among the personnel was Doc, a seasoned medic who had seen more battlefields than most of the officers combined. Unassuming and modest, Doc carried no formal insignia, only the Red Cross patch on the arm of their uniform. To the Kron, Doc was invisible, a mere functionary far removed from the command structure. The Kron delegation arrived, their imposing figures making an immediate impression. They were escorted into the command center, where the human officers waited. The Kron scrutinized each face, matching insignia to their database of ranks. Their attention never lingered on Doc, who was quietly stationed near the medbay entrance, observing the interaction from a distance. As the Kron diplomats began their discussions, a sudden tremor rocked the outpost. Klaxons blared, and lights flickered. The attack was swift and brutal. An unidentified force had emerged from hyperspace, their ships opening fire without warning. Chaos erupted. Communications were scrambled, and the Kron diplomats froze in shock, unaccustomed to the unpredictability of such a situation. Their rigid chain of command became an anchor, dragging them down as they awaited explicit instructions. In the chaos, the human officers scrambled to coordinate defenses, but the attack had disrupted critical systems. The chain of command fragmented as injuries and confusion spread. The Kron observed in disbelief as a figure they deemed insignificant, Doc, stepped forward, barking orders with an authority that defied their understanding. "Secure the injured and get them to the med bay," Doc commanded, motioning to a group of soldiers. "You grab 2 others and reinforce the eastern perimeter. Move now." There was no hesitation in the responses. Humans who outranked Doc by every metric the Kron understood followed the medic's directives without question. The Kron delegation watched, their confusion mounting. How could someone without a rank insignia take charge? More baffling was the human soldiers' willingness to comply. There were no formal salutes, no elaborate acknowledgments, only swift action born of trust. The Kron attempted to re-establish communication with their fleet, but their systems were compromised. Their leader, a stern figure named Vakral, turned to the humans for guidance, but was met with uncertainty. Our chain of command is compromised, one officer admitted, grimacing. But Doc seems to have things under control. Vokral's mandibles clicked in irritation. This Doc is not a commanding officer. Where is your highest-ranking leader? The officer, bleeding from a wound on his temple, gestured toward document. Right now? That's them? Vokral stared, uncomprehending. A medic? Trust me, the officer replied, before limping off to follow one of Doc's directives. The alien leader turned his attention to the medic, who was now orchestrating a counterattack. Doc's voice cut through the noise, issuing clear, concise orders. They had split their focus between managing the wounded and directing defensive efforts, all while exuding an air of calm determination. The Kron delegation remained in stunned silence, observing the humans adapt with a fluidity they had never witnessed. Their own soldiers, who had been frozen by the absence of explicit commands, began to move reluctantly under Doc's direction. Doc's actions defied everything the Kron believed about leadership. Here was someone with no visible rank, commanding both respect and compliance, not through authority, but through competence and presence. The Kron's rigid system, designed for clarity and order, faltered in the face of this chaotic battlefield. Meanwhile, the humans, led by their unassuming medic, displayed a resilience and adaptability that the Kron found both alien and extraordinary. For the first time, the Kron began to question the limits of their understanding. The bombardment intensified, each strike shaking the outpost to its core. Sparks flew from damaged conduits, and the acrid stench of scorched metal filled the air. Sirens wailed over the chaos, but communication channels were nothing but static. The command center, once a hub of calculated precision, devolved into a scene of disarray. The Kron delegation huddled near a console, their attempts to reach their fleet proving futile. Their leaders, conditioned to await explicit directives, stood immobilized, scanning the room for a commanding figure to restore order. Among the humans, officers were either incapacitated, buried under debris, or preoccupied with immediate threats. Panic rippled through the ranks as junior personnel hesitated, uncertain whose orders to follow. Amidst the confusion, Doc emerged. Without waiting for consensus or approval, they moved with purpose, assessing the chaos like a battlefield triage. Their voice cut through the cacophony, firm but calm. Team Alpha, get the injured to medbay. Use whatever transport you can find. Team Beta, reinforce the airlock barricades immediately. I need fire suppression on Deck 3 now. Human soldiers snapped into action, following Doc's directives without question. Rank insignias glinted on their uniforms, marking them as personnel who technically outranked the medic. Yet none of them hesitated. The Kron delegation observed in stunned silence. Vokral, their leader, clicked his mandibles in confusion. Why do they follow? This Doc has no rank, no authority. One of the Kron soldiers, still frozen by the absence of orders, muttered. Perhaps it is Chaos Leader. Perhaps they do not follow, but merely scramble. But this was no chaos. There was rhythm in the human response, a pattern of trust that escaped the Kron's understanding. Doc moved like a conductor in a storm, each order building toward a strategy. They had already mapped the crisis in their mind. Choke points, critical systems, and resources that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. A group of soldiers carrying injured personnel paused, unsure where to take the wounded. Doc intercepted them mid-step. Medbay's compromised, they said quickly, gesturing toward a storage area. Set up a triage station there. Use crates for stretchers and prioritize those who can return to duty fastest. Move. The Kron, rigid in their approach, found the fluidity disconcerting. No ranks? No protocol? Vokral muttered, incredulous. Nearby, Kron soldiers stood idly, unsure of their place in the chaos. Doc spotted them and moved directly into their midst. You, they called to the tallest one, who stiffened instinctively. What's your name? The alien hesitated before stammering. Jakal, defender. Fine. Jakal, get your people to the south corridor. The airlock stabilizer's failing, and we need it patched. Grab any tools you can find. If it goes, we're all done for. Go now. Jakal blinked, glancing at Vakral as if seeking permission. When none came, they hesitated. Doc stepped closer, their tone sharp. You want to survive? Then move. Jakal didn't wait for a second prompt. Rallying the Kron soldiers, they headed for the airlock. Vakral watched, his confusion deepening. In Kron society, an order from someone of lower rank was grounds for reprimand, if not outright dishonor. Yet here, this unranked human had commanded compliance through sheer urgency and presence. The medic's resourcefulness continued to astonish. When a damaged power conduit exploded, cutting off access to a critical corridor, Doc commandeered a maintenance crew to reroute the system. When the supply cache became inaccessible, they improvised with what was at hand, converting standard-issue field kits into makeshift tools. At every turn, Doc's actions demonstrated a startling contrast to Kron leadership. Where Kron commanders hesitated, paralyzed by the absence of clear protocol, Doc adapted, inventing solutions on the fly. A Kron envoy, braver than most, approached Doc cautiously. You are not the leader. How do they obey? Doc didn't look up from the field map they were hastily scrawling onto a cracked datapad. They obey because they trust one know what I'm doing, they said simply. You want to help? Tell me how many of your people are still combat ready. The envoy hesitated, but eventually relayed the numbers. Doc nodded, gesturing toward the western wing. Good. Reinforce the shield generator there. If that goes down, nothing else matters. The envoy stared for a moment, then complied. Trust, Doc had said. A concept the Kron rarely associated with leadership, which to them was dictated by status and ritual, not the merits of action. Meanwhile, Vakral observed with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Humans were not operating as the Kron expected. Their ranks were irrelevant in this moment. What mattered was competence, quick thinking, and a willingness to act. Leader Vakral, a Kron subordinate, ventured hesitantly. Perhaps we should... No, Vakral interrupted, though his tone lacked conviction. His rigid adherence to protocol wavered as he watched his own soldiers obeying Doc's orders, moving with a purpose their own leaders had failed to inspire. By the time the first wave of attacks subsided, the outpost was battered but still standing. Doc had orchestrated the defenses like a seasoned commander, seamlessly blending human and Kron efforts. The alien soldiers, initially reluctant, now carried out the medic's instructions with growing efficiency. When the dust began to settle, Vakral approached Doc directly, his towering form casting a shadow. You are no commander, no general. And yet you command. Doc, covered in soot and blood, none of it their own, glanced up with a weary expression. Command isn't about rank, they said simply. It's about stepping up when it matters. Vakral regarded them silently, grappling with the implications. For the Kron, this moment was a revelation. For Doc, it was another day on the battlefield. The enemy's strategy became apparent as the battle progressed. Their strikes weren't random. They targeted communication arrays, command terminals, and critical points where leadership was most centralized. For the Kron, this was devastating. Their rigid structure, built entirely on clear chains of command, crumbled as their leaders were systematically neutralized. Without explicit instructions, Kron soldiers froze, unable to act. Vakral attempted to re-establish order, barking commands to his remaining officers. His words carried authority, but no strategy. With each passing minute, their forces became more isolated, their efficiency diminishing. The attackers capitalized on this, herding the Kron into defensive pockets, pinning them in place with precision strikes. The humans fared better, but the situation was dire. Doc, now acting as the de facto leader of the outpost, evaluated the attackers' movements. Their strategy was clever, too clever. The enemy had studied their opponents well and was exploiting their weaknesses with surgical precision. Doc gathered the remaining human soldiers, sketching a crude map of the battlefield on the floor. "They're baiting us into traditional responses," they said, pointing to the areas where both human and Kron forces had been hit hardest. "We need to stop reacting and start acting." Vokral, still reeling from the loss of his command structure, overheard. "You propose to lead my soldiers as well?" His tone was sharp, but it lacked the conviction it once carried. "Lead them? No," Doc replied without looking up. "But if they want to survive, they'll need to work with us. And fast." The Kron leader bristled. "Our warriors follow orders, not improvisation." "They'll follow if they want to live," interjected a human officer, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch. "Doc's kept us alive through worse. You can either get on board or get left behind." Vokral hesitated, his gaze shifting between the officer and the medic. The notion of following someone without rank graded against every principle he held. But the evidence was undeniable. Doc wasted no time outlining an unconventional plan. The outpost terrain provided opportunities the attackers hadn't accounted for. Narrow corridors that could serve as choke points, maintenance shafts leading to blind spots, and damaged infrastructure that could be rigged into makeshift traps. "Jakal," Doc called out, addressing the Kron soldier they'd worked with earlier. "You're leading the charge here. Take your squad and flank them through the east tunnels. We'll draw their fire from the north." Vokral interjected. "You cannot simply—" "Watch me," Doc snapped, cutting him off. "Your soldiers are good, Vokral, but they're being wasted standing around waiting for orders that aren't coming. Let them fight." There was no time for further argument. Jakal nodded, rallying his squad and heading for the tunnels. Vokral watched, his jaw tightening as his soldiers obeyed the human medic without hesitation. As the plan unfolded, the attackers found themselves facing unexpected resistance. Doc's tactics were unconventional, relying on speed, adaptability, and the element of surprise. Kron warriors, initially skeptical, found themselves moving with newfound confidence under Doc's direction. For the first time, they weren't waiting for orders. They were part of a strategy that evolved in real time. Despite the progress, the battle reached a critical moment. The attackers unleashed a devastating weapon, a massive energy cannon that tore through the outpost's defenses with terrifying efficiency. If it wasn't neutralized, the outpost would be obliterated. Vokral and his officers argued among themselves, paralyzed by the enormity of the threat. Doc didn't wait. They grabbed a small team, a mix of human soldiers and Kron warriors, and outlined a desperate plan to disable the cannon. "The approach is too exposed," a Kron soldier objected. "That's why we don't go in the way they expect," Doc replied. "We use the maintenance shafts to get under it and disable the power supply." Vokral stepped forward. "You are not trained for such an assault. This is reckless." Doc locked eyes with him. "It's also the only chance we've got." With time running out, Vokral finally relented, allowing a few of his best warriors to join the mission. The team moved quickly, navigating through smoke-filled corridors and collapsing infrastructure. Reaching the base of the cannon, they found it heavily guarded. Doc improvised, using a combination of human explosives and Kron shock weapons to create a diversion. As the guards scrambled to respond, Doc and a Kron engineer worked side by side, dismantling the cannon's power supply. The operation was grueling. Every second felt like an eternity, and the risk of failure loomed over them. But Doc's steady leadership kept the team focused. When the final connection was severed, the cannon powered down with a sputtering whine. The attackers, suddenly deprived of their most potent weapon, faltered. The tide of the battle shifted as human and Kron forces rallied, pressing the advantage. Back at the command center, Vokral watched the cannon go dark. For the first time, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar, respect for the human approach. Doc, a medic with no formal rank, had accomplished what his rigid structure could not. When the team returned, Battered but victorious, Vakral approached Document. "You have shown adaptability," he said, the word unfamiliar on his tongue. Doc, exhausted but unbroken, simply nodded. "Adapt or die. That's how we do it." Vakral said nothing more, but the weight of the moment lingered. For the Kron, this battle wasn't just a victory. It was a revelation. The air around the outpost was heavy with the scent of smoldering wreckage. Debris littered the corridors, and the once bustling command center was now a makeshift triage zone. Despite the damage, the mood was one of cautious relief. The battle was won, but its implications lingered, especially for the Kron. Vakral stood with his officers, their postures less rigid than before. His mandibles clicked softly as he observed the scene before him. Humans and Kron working side by side to repair the outpost and tend to the wounded. It was an image he never would have imagined before this encounter. Jakal approached, his armor scratched and dented. "Leader Vakral," he began, his tone hesitant. "I must admit, their methods were effective. The medic, this doc, achieved what our structure could not." Vakral turned to face his subordinate. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze lingering on Doc, who was crouched over a wounded Kron soldier, calmly giving instructions to a human medic. The scene was a stark contradiction to everything the Kron believed about command and respect. Later, in a quieter corner of the outpost, the Kron diplomats requested an audience, with Document. Vakral stood alongside them, his usual air of superiority tempered by something new, curiosity, perhaps even humility. "You have confounded us," one of the diplomats admitted, their tone measured. "We believed we understood your people, your military structure, your reliance on hierarchy, yet you defy these principles?" Doc leaned back, wiping grime from their face with a rag. "I don't defy anything. Humans do have ranks and structure, sure. But when things go sideways, those things only matter so much. What matters more is knowing who can get the job done." Vakral's mandibles twitched. "But you lack rank. Authority. Why did they follow you?" Doc shrugged. "Because they trust me. I've been through enough battles with these people that they know I won't lead them wrong. Trust doesn't come from a title or insignia. It comes from showing up time and time again and proving you can handle what's thrown at you." The Kron delegation exchanged glances, their confusion apparent. Vakral tilted his head. "Your trust is earned, not bestowed by position." "Exactly," Doc replied. "Titles are useful, but they're not the be-all and end-all. In a crisis, the person with the best plan leads, no matter their rank. It's about adaptability, teamwork, and knowing when to step up." One of Vakral's officers, an older Kron with scars that spoke of long service, stepped forward. "This adaptability is foreign to us. Our hierarchy demands order structure. We cannot act without clear directives. And that's why you almost lost today," a human officer chimed in, joining the conversation. "Your chain of command is strong, but it's brittle. When the head is cut off, the body can't move. Our system? It's more flexible. If one leader falls, another steps up, even if they don't have the formal title. That's how we survive." Vakral considered this, his posture stiffening as the truth settled in. "Your methods are chaotic, yet effective." Doc smiled faintly. "Chaos has its advantages. It forces us to adapt, to think on our feet. That's why we work the way we do. It keeps us alive." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling over everyone. For the Kron, this was more than a tactical lesson. It was a challenge to their very identity. Their rigid adherence to hierarchy had been a point of pride, a cornerstone of their culture. To see it falter in the face of human flexibility was humbling. Vakral finally spoke, his tone subdued but resolute. "Your approach is instructive. Perhaps we have relied too heavily on the comfort of structure, to our detriment." One of the diplomats, a figure who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward. "This doc has shown us something valuable, a different way of thinking. It is clear that our understanding of humanity was incomplete. We came here seeking to establish relations with a species we believed to be like ourselves. We now see that your differences are your strength. Doc inclined their head. And maybe your strengths can teach us something, too. There's value in structure and discipline. It's not about one way being better than the other. It's about finding balance. The Kron delegation nodded thoughtfully. Vakral, after a long pause, stepped closer to document. Your actions today saved not only your people but mine as well. You have earned more than respect. You have earned honor. He gestured to one of his officers, who presented a small, ornate device. This is the mark of accord, a symbol of trust and cooperation. It is rarely given to those outside our kind. But today you have proven that such honors are not limited by species. Doc accepted the mark with a humble nod. Thank you. Let's hope this is the start of something better for both our people. The Kron delegation exchanged formal gestures of respect, and Vakral added, perhaps we have much to learn from one another. This adaptability you speak of may hold lessons for us all. As the meeting concluded, there was a sense of mutual understanding, a recognition that their differences could be strengths, not divides. The Kron departed with a newfound respect for humanity, carrying with them the realization that adaptability, trust, and collaboration could complement their structured ways. For Doc and the humans at the outpost, it was a moment of quiet triumph, not just for winning the battle, but for forging a connection that might lead to a better future. The weeks that followed the battle brought changes to both the outpost and the Kron forces. Repairs progressed steadily, but something deeper was shifting. The Kron military, so long defined by rigid hierarchies, began experimenting with human-inspired practices. Vakral's influence played a pivotal role. Though initially resistant, the Kron leader had witnessed the effectiveness of adaptability firsthand. He convened a series of meetings with his officers, pushing them to consider scenarios where command structures might falter. These discussions, once unthinkable, laid the groundwork for a more flexible approach to leadership. Kron training drills began to incorporate exercises in autonomy and quick decision-making. Officers were encouraged to foster initiative among their subordinates, a notion that initially caused discomfort but soon revealed its merit. Jakal, who had fought alongside Doc, became a vocal advocate for these changes, sharing his experience of how improvisation and trust had turned the tide of battle. In human space, Doc's story spread quickly. Reports of the medic who led a combined human-Kron force against overwhelming odds captured imaginations across the galaxy. Military academies began using the incident as a case study in adaptability and unconventional leadership. For the Kron, it became a symbol of transformation, a reminder that even the most deeply ingrained traditions could evolve when survival demanded it. One day, Doc stood on a hill overlooking the repaired outpost. The landscape still bore scars from the battle, blackened craters, twisted metal, and the faint hum of machinery working to restore what had been lost. Doc held the Kron's mark of accord in one hand, turning it over thoughtfully. "You don't seem like the type to sit still for long," a familiar voice called out. It was the human officer who had defended Doc's leadership to Vakral during the fight. He limped slightly, a permanent reminder of the chaos they'd survived together. "Just thinking," Doc replied, not turning around. The officer settled beside them. "About the medals and the history books?" Doc laughed quietly. "Not exactly. I'm thinking about how close we came to losing everything. If things had gone just a little differently." They trailed off, shaking their head. "It's not about glory. It never has been. I just want to make sure people live to see tomorrow, whether they're human or Kron or anyone else." The officer nodded, understanding. "Well, you did more than that. You didn't just save lives, you changed minds. That's a rare thing." Down below, a group of Kron soldiers worked alongside human engineers, constructing a shared facility. It was part barracks, part training center, a symbol of the growing alliance between the two species. Watching them, Doc felt a flicker of hope. A short time later, Doc was summoned to a formal ceremony hosted by the Kron delegation. Vakral stood at the forefront, his imposing figure framed by banners bearing the sigil of his people. Despite his usual stern demeanor, there was a warmth in his gaze as Doc approached. Today, Vakral began, addressing the gathered crowd. We honor not just a warrior, but a bridge between worlds. This human, this Doc, has shown us that strength does not lie solely in hierarchy, but in unity, trust, and adaptability. The ceremony included an exchange of gifts. The Kron presented Doc with a ceremonial blade, intricately carved with symbols representing adaptability and harmony. In return, Doc handed Vakral a patch bearing the insignia of their unit, a small but meaningful gesture of solidarity. As the ceremony concluded, a Kron officer approached Doc, saluting in a manner that was clearly borrowed from human traditions. We have much to learn from you, the officer said. And, I hope, much to teach in return. Doc smiled. That's the idea. Later that evening, Doc found a quiet spot to reflect. The weight of everything that had happened, the battles, the alliances, the lives saved and lost, pressed down on them. Yet, there was a sense of closure, too. The Kron were changing, and so were the humans. Together, they were building something stronger than either could achieve alone. The horizon glowed faintly as the outpost's lights flickered on, a beacon in the darkness. It wasn't just a symbol of survival. It was a promise of what could come next.